How often have you heard people in our community ask a question something like this? Oh, yeah? Well, where in the law does it say I can do that? Let's talk about why this might be one of the most dangerous questions to ask.
While the host of Fuddbusters is a lawyer, he is not your lawyer. If you pay him, maybe, either way you slice it, the video that you are about to watch is not to be construed as legal advice.
Today we're going to talk about some core theory of government stuff. The stuff that's behind the line I say at the end of every episode. Where does our liberty end and government power begin? To illustrate this, let's talk about some of the questions you might hear when talking about, 3D printing a firearm or doing basically anything cool. Forums are a great source for this type of argument, as my aortic valves can tell you, having endured a great many reads myself. You'll see it all too often. Someone does a thing. Maybe they assembled a neat gun. Maybe they 3D printed something and shot it. Then some hall monitor comes in and goes, "Is that even legal?" The individual will demand to see a statute that lines out exactly what they are allowed to do, and if you can't show them a line of law that says you may wipe your own butt, they'll believe it's illegal to do so. What's really concerning here is that we've gotten to a point in our society where this thought process seems reasonable. In actuality, though, it's completely counter to our very system of law. You see, around the time of our nation's founding, there were developing two systems with respect to human rights. There are names to these competing theories, but every time you try to use one, you wind up pissing everyone off. So, to avoid unnecessary strife, I'll call them the American model and the island model. This has nothing to do with geography, and I'm not referring to any particular island. It'll make more sense in a bit. Let's start with the American model, which, given the composition of my viewership, is likely the one most relevant to you. To understand this, you have to put yourself in the mind of the people who had just fought a bitter war with what were up to this point their countrymen, over a very real perception of their rights being deprived by an unaccountable government. The ideal that rose to the top following these events were those of a servant government, the master of which being its people. The right of the individual to preserve himself, be it defense against unlawful force, or in the ability to earn a living in his trade, was at the very core of this. Everything flowed from the autonomy of man. Still, it was understood then that there must be government instituted among men, both to secure the liberty of individuals and to guard against certain externalities. The compromise then was to set up a society with a sea of liberty, wherein man can be presumed to swim freely without permission, interrupted by limited, clearly defined islands of government power. This is why our founding documents do not grant any rights, they merely recognize the pre-existence of human rights and explicitly set up a government whose powers are few and defined. In a system built on this model, an individual ought never ask to be shown that he can do something. Rather, the onus is flatly on the government to tell him explicitly what is forbidden. This was terribly stressful for some people and certainly wasn't without its detractors. To be sure, some people want to be told very explicitly where the lines are. For the most part, though, the people were happy, with certain horrific exceptions, to be sure. Still, though, those in positions of power are self-interested, as all humans are. Even just a few years after our nation's founding, there were those who sought to go back to a much more permission-centered society. I think this letter from Thomas Jefferson to Philip Mazzei in 1797 is particularly illuminating. Mazzei had left the U.S. around 1785 and began promoting American ideals in Europe. In it, Jefferson wrote, "Our political situation is prodigiously changed since you left us. Instead of that noble love of liberty and that republican government which carried us triumphantly through the dangers of war, an Anglo-monarchio-aristocratic party has arisen. Nevertheless, the principal body of our citizens remain faithful to republican principles. All our proprietors of lands are friendly to those principles, as also the mass of men of talents. We have against us the executive power, the judiciary power, all the officers of government, all who are seeking offices, all timid men who prefer the calm of despotism to the tempestuous sea of liberty. This letter was provocative and controversial, especially given it was written as George Washington was being replaced with John Adams. Jefferson had come to believe that those who worked in government were merely seeking places of power, more interested in their jobs than serving the people, and that a group of people had emerged, gaining power from lending the government money. Geez, this all sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? In spite of these problems, Jefferson believed that the bulk of the American people still adhered to the principles which made winning the Revolutionary War possible. Now, Jefferson isn't without his problems. No historical figure is perfect. But I think these observations are illuminating. Even then, as the government amassed more powers, he saw the model slipping towards that other one, which they had just escaped. So let's talk about that other model, what I call the island model. In the island model, man is told quite clearly, these are your rights. They are very clearly enumerated by the government. All else, you must understand, is subject to the government's power. On this model, man stands on an island of liberty and gazes out over a sea of government power. If he chooses to swim, he is imperiled to check before each stroke. Still, for this model, there are some advantages. The timid can always trust to look to their government to see whether what they want to do is permitted. If it is not, they are entitled to the comforting belief that it simply ought not be done. In these models, your rights are usually found in some enacted piece of legislation. Think about the implications here. This gets into positive and natural rights. Positive law describes the establishment of specific rights to a group or an individual. Natural law, which is what the American model is meant to respect, consists of rights that were not handed through legislation, but rather by God, nature, or reason. With positive rights, as is the case for most of the world, very little prevents the government from fiddling with them. In reality, they're more like privileges than rights in this respect. With natural rights, the right is considered beyond the scope of man, something that, for natural reasons, the government simply cannot touch. Still, though, we find ourselves in the situation we are in today. America is far from the freest country in many respects, but our right to self-defense still seems to top the charts, and much of our feeling of liberty flows therefrom. It's unquestionable that our liberty has eroded over the years, and I think Jefferson's concern hold as much truth now as they did then, perhaps even more. It will always be the nature of government to expand its own power. The biggest challenge facing that is the perception of the public, the unwritten bounds of what is acceptable, kind of like the Overton window. When we ask, where does it say I can do that? We're tacitly embracing those theories our government was founded specifically to oppose. It's imperative that we remember and remind our peers that we, the people, are the master and the government the servant, not the other way around. It's imperative that we remember it is supposed to be a sea of liberty we're swimming in with few and defined islands of governmental power, not the other way around. So that's why when you hear that kind of talk, you should give your friends a firm talking to, or direct them to this video. Let me do it. Also, if you haven't started printing, you really ought to start. I'll put some affiliate links down below, both with recommended reading and for a printer. This is why I always say what I say at the end of the video. When you presume the government has more power than it does, you're artificially enlarging those islands and turning your sea of liberty into a kiddie pool or a ball pit. Nobody wants that. Let me just say I really appreciate you guys watching and subscribing. It makes a huge difference. If you want to support me more than that, I started up a Patreon and a Subscribe Star. I've added benefits like a patron-only podcast, a Discord, surely more to come. This kind of support will help enable me to make more content more regularly, something I'd really love to be able to do. There's also a link to the Fuddbusters sticker and the Magic ATF ball in the description below. Thank you all so much for watching to the end and for your support. I'll see you next time. Or if you become a patron or subscribe star, I'll see you on the Discord. Remember, the anti-side has been working long and hard passing laws and trying to make more. Anything more than minimum compliance is self-regulation. Y'all take care.